Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights 15th report of the 44th Parliament. Senator Ludlam.
Thank you very much, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise to thank the members and the Secretariat of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights for their valuable contribution to the debate over the government's proposal for mandatory data retention for the entire Australian population. The proposal has copped a bit of a bucketing since it first emerged into the light of day from the telecommunications industry, from digital rights organisations and advocates from right across the political spectrum. The government is on the back foot, such that it has delayed debate on the bill to 2015, and that the ALP and the crossbenchers have raised significant concerns alongside those of the Australian Greens, so we may yet get our 38 votes. Nonetheless, I'm still asked in nearly every interview on the subject and in most public meetings, if I'm not doing anything wrong, why should I worry about government surveillance? It may well be indiscriminate, but I actually have nothing to hide, or at least nothing that the state would have any reason to come looking for. The question's entirely reasonable, but it still throws me when I hear it. Yesterday, myself, my colleagues, some of my colleagues had the privilege of spending an hour with Chinese pro-democracy leaders living here in Australia, who had joined us on the occasion of Chinese President Xi Jinping's address to the Australian Parliament. They spoke on behalf of the Tibetan community, who are suffering violent slow-motion genocide that has led 140 young Tibetans to self-immolate as the only form of visible dissent that can't easily be stopped by the Chinese authorities. They spoke on behalf of the Uyghur community and Mr Ilham Tohti, a prominent scholar and host of Uyghur Online, who was jailed for life this September for publishing a mild critique of the impact of the Chinese government's authoritarian crackdown in Xinjiang province. They spoke on behalf of the Falun Gong practice in China, whose members' allegations of industrial-scale organ harvesting seem impossible to believe until you read the independent reports into the practice. And they spoke on behalf of those mainstream Chinese families who have had to flee Chinese Communist Party rule for a whole variety of reasons. This is a country in which a difference of opinion can get you killed or sent to a re-education through labour camp for the rest of your life. None of these issues made it into the President's speech or into anything that we're aware of that was raised by the Prime Minister or the Leader of the Opposition. Conversations like this with people who have direct personal experience of what it's like to live under an authoritarian regime finally settled for me that question about why you should fear instruments like mandatory data retention if you have nothing to hide. Now, in February of 2013, Mandiant Security Consulting Service published, I guess what you could say was an unprecedented report into one of China's cyber espionage units. And some of what they published is apocryphal, some of it is circumstantial, but this consultancy figured that what they had been tracking and had discovered was important enough that they should put it into the public domain. In the highlights, they suggest that their analysis has concluded that this entity they called APT-1, or Advanced Persistent Threat 1, is likely government-sponsored and one of the most persistent of China's cyber threat actors. This is basically corporate espionage. It's what they allege is that it's a unit of the Chinese People's Liberation Army based mostly out of Shanghai that effectively infiltrates corporations or government departments and loots their servers and their databases using a variety of hacking techniques to conduct espionage. And that's how, we don't know whether it was this unit or anything of the sort, things like the floor plans for the new ASIO building, things like technical documentation for the Joint Strike Fighter have found their way from military or industrial servers here and overseas into the hands of the Chinese government. And it's a study that you kind of understand or assume that this kind of behaviour goes on, but it's really quite stark to see it expressed in detail, the degree of sophistication used by government-sponsored hackers, certainly as alleged in this report. But it got me thinking about the degree to which these tools and techniques also get turned on political dissidents, and the literature is actually quite forbidding the degree to which the Tibetan or the Uyghur diaspora community have found the tools of cyber espionage turned upon them. Really sophisticated hacking attacks going after Tibetan or pro-democracy campaigners or Uyghur campaigners, people living here in Australia or in other Western democracies, where we just assume that the state wouldn't come after us using these kind of extraordinarily hostile range of techniques and technologies, ways of basically owning your mobile phone from a great distance so that you can switch on its camera, so that geolocation data can be sent back to Chinese government authorities, so that microphones can be switched on, conversations can be recorded, and people's precise locations can be mapped as they move around the landscape. And these are tools that are being turned on dissidents. You know, I'm using China as one example because this experience obviously is very fresh in my mind as a result of these conversations from yesterday. But authoritarian regimes around the world use these very same tools at home and abroad to crack down on dissidents and on people who have political views with which they strongly disagree. And there is absolutely no reason to believe that this behaviour is not levelled, at least by Chinese authorities, on Tibetan dissidents or on Uyghur dissidents or on people that, no matter what our political perspectives here in Australia, we would not support the Australian government turning those kind of tools on dissident communities or on people who express different political views. It's one of the things that I think, I hope and I would expect that we would all value the most about living in a country like Australia. But when we hosted an event on data retention in this building 3 or 4 weeks ago now that featured this huge range of opinions from industry, from the private sector, from advocacy groups as diverse as the Australian Privacy Foundation, the Institute of Public Affairs, other allies who wouldn't normally find themselves in the same room together. And just acknowledging my Senate colleague Lionhelm has joined us, and Senator Xenophon, who co-hosted that event with me. IINet put the case very starkly. They weren't necessarily speaking for their own business case, but for the industry generally. You bring in this massively expensive mandatory data retention regime into Australia, you are forcing and imposing costs on industry. The government doesn't know who is going to pick up the tab for this brand new surveillance tax that wasn't announced before the election. What we understand is, as a result of a PwC consultancy that hasn't been put into the public domain and for all we know is as yet unfinished, is that industry will have to be passing along some of these costs in increased data charges, and the taxpayer will pick up the rest of the tab. It's a really misconceived idea, and I hope those of sound mind inside the coalition, because I know there's a measure of dissent inside the coalition, actually push back internally and make sure this thing doesn't go any further. But the fact of that cost, what the IINet representatives told us is, if you force industry to warehouse these massive new archives of data that we don't want, that we don't need for billing purposes, where's it going to end up? It's going to end up with Chinese cloud hosting providers because they're cheap. So think about that for a second, that if you are a Tibetan living here in exile, if you are worried about your families still inside Tibet, if you're a Chinese pro-democracy campaigner, if you had some part to play in the Umbrella Revolution in Hong Kong, or if you have upset some authoritarian government somewhere in the world and found yourself the good fortune to find yourself in Australia, what are we proposing to do? What is this Australian government proposing to do? Is force industry to archive everywhere you take your device, everyone you're in touch with, your whole social network, your movements, your bank transactions, your health care records, conversations you might have with your legal representatives. And industry is saying, probably costs are going to force a lot of these data warehouses into Chinese cloud hosting providers. And how the hell are we going to safeguard that kind of material? And that really hit home to me yesterday. Some people do have something to hide. Some people actually do have something to hide. If you don't, if you actually think you're a complete open book, I actually respect that position. I mean, I'd ask you to think about whether you have curtains on your windows, whether you close the door when you go to the bathroom, whether you have passwords on your email accounts, all of the other multiple ways in which we express that fundamental human right to privacy. But you still may hold no fear for yourself. But I do hold fear for those pro-democracy campaigners or for people here in Australia with opinions that the Australian government might disagree with from time to time, people who might be finding themselves standing in the way of coal-loading machinery, for example, to have these techniques turned against civil society actors, whistleblowers, campaigners, journalists, or some of these dissidents that we met yesterday. Some people do have something to hide, and I think it's a very, very important part of the work of this Parliament's Human Rights Committee, where they have said in black and white that this proposal should not proceed in the form that it's been drafted, because when you view data retention through a human rights lens, it doesn't fail the common sense test.
Thank you, Senator.